We are now privileged to hear a presentation by Dr. William Tiller, who's a very popular Stanford scientist, and who has spent most of his career scientifically validating the phenomenon of intention and intuition, which of course are the centerpiece of these tapes. Dr. Tiller's presentation is necessarily technical and might even use a few terms that would be unfamiliar to many. That's okay. His presentation is quite clear and serves to punctuate the very important subjects that we are exploring within these tapes. Here's Dr. Tiller. Can we have a hand for Dr. William Tiller? I say, can we have a hand for Dr. William Tiller? So popular, Bill.
Oh, what an awesome group. Fortunately, you're part of me, and therefore I bask in the glory of myself.
You need to put it a little higher. Right about there is good. Right about there. Yeah, that should be good. Yeah. I want to mention something we didn't mention earlier, but that's how I met Bill. And we didn't really officially meet, so to speak.
No.
In 1962, I was just graduating from the Metallurgical School of Engineering at Stanford, and Bill was just coming in as a new professor there.
I was
Interviewing. Okay, I thought you were there. Whatever. But I remember seeing you and thinking, oh, I like that guy, because there was something very unengineering about him. You see? I mean, he had a certain glow about it. I said to myself, I would love to have taken a course or two, but I was about to graduate and it didn't work and so on. And I remembered him. He didn't remember me. Yeah, one night he didn't remember me at all. You know. But at any rate, when his book came out, and you know, I called him up, and we've had three lunches now in great detail about his process and his findings, and it fits here so nicely. So what we're going to do here, I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask you just to interface, you know, with what we've been talking about here. But then what Bill's going to do after that is going to give you a background on himself, and he has a presentation to make, and we have a number of slides that you'll find quite interesting. And then after that, after he finishes that, we'll come up and you can ask questions, and that's kind of how it'll go. Yeah. So let me get my little questions. Whoops, where are we? My questions out here. It's one I already alluded to, but I just want your emphasis on it if we can. When two different people get together to do healing, a client and a therapist, for example, they are not likely to have exactly the same routines that their intuition tells them to do, correct?
Yes.
And why?
Okay. We are all in the process of becoming. And by that I mean that there is different levels of structure at our different subtle bodies at any point in time. One person's at a different place than another. And so now when you want to look at the interaction between you and a patient, a client, versus another person and the client, the interaction isn't just between the two of you. It really, is a three-body effect with the universe involved. And there's a whole energy circuit involved in that process. And depending upon where you are at that average point in time and where the client is at that average point in time, there are optimal points to treat to get to the most beneficial result. On other days, even shortly in the future, you might be at a slightly different place and the client might be at a slightly different place, and the universe, in its wisdom, knows basically that there might be a more optimal set of points to treat in order to get the most beneficial results. And that would be my answer.
Sure. And paraphrasing, you added something to that, and that is that I could deal with a client right now and I would get a certain set of points that would be valuable. If I did it the next day, and we had never even tried to do it the first day, but the next day came along, I would get a different set of points altogether because we're at a different point in time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And if you had a different client a couple of years from now and you've been working on this stuff, your energy structure would have changed, and in fact, probably you do it a little differently, not through any conscious way, but because your system will reveal itself to you differently.
Sure. You're a Stanford engineering professor, basically, which means supposedly you're supposed to do all the standard physics and chemistry and all of that stuff.
All that good stuff.
About which intuition is not necessarily part of the curriculum.
Well, that's because it's not known, and at any point in time, I think there is much more unknown in the universe than that which is known. So we're always dealing only with the tip of the iceberg.
Yes.
And it is fallacious to think that that's all there is.
Okay. Well, this is kind of a segue for me,
Yep.
me to leave this to you and get off the stage for a second. So why don't you discuss with them how you were able as a Stanford professor to have the time to do something which is not really necessarily mainstream in that area, and spend all this time on all these controlled studies, and you might give a little bit of your background and so on.
Okay.
I will leave that in your lap, Bill.
All right. Let's see, where to begin? About 35 years ago, my wife and I came to California, and she said, Bill, now that we're here in this new place, how about pulling together the spiritual side of our life? I thought, that sounds like a good idea. And so we got involved in meditational techniques. We did it via the Edgar Cayce activities. And so that started a certain path of inner work. We had before then been doing things off and on, and at a very young age I was very much interested in trusting my intuition. But anyway, that's the beginning. And then about 30 years ago, while I was department chairman at Material Science and Engineering at Stanford, and I was on a variety of government committees and professional committees at the highest levels, I read this neat little book called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain by Ostrander and Schroeder. And I thought this is an interesting book, and I spent a very good part of my meditational time over the next year trying to assess how it might be that the universe would be constructed to allow this seemingly crazy sort of stuff to coexist with the straight, conventional stuff that I was doing day to day. And at the end of that year, I decided this is too important to just let go. It was necessary to do some serious research in that area. And the problem was, well, to do some research, where are you going to get the extra time? I thought, well, what could I give up? I need my job because my family needs it to live on, and I need to be stable. I can only do things from a stable base. So I thought, well, I could give up my power positions. So I gave up, and there's a lot of overhead associated with power, as you know. So I gave up being department chairman. I gave up all my committees, and then I had some time. And so I then started life with dual paths. My conventional path at Stanford needed to fulfill the job. Writing papers, getting government money, having research students, teaching classes, all those things, faculty meetings, the works. And then on the side, my avocational life, then I was going to devote to this other area. And I divided the time, that extra time that I would spend in that area, into 3 boxes. The first third was the experiential development of self, because it's so important to begin to feel and understand this class of phenomena in order to perhaps have a chance of understanding it. The second third was in theoretical modeling of the universe to see if I could describe a way that it might be constructed to allow these things to be rational in the same kind of framework as conventional understanding. And the third was to design experiments to keep the theory honest. And so that was the path that I set out on, and they were very full weeks. My wife took care of the things at home, of the children, and I did my Stanford job, and I did this other job. And so 30 years later, I sit before you, sort of ready to tell you some of what I've deduced, what my perspective is on this now, and tell you a little bit about it. And my perspective is as follows. We are all spirits having a physical experience together. as we ride the river of life. Our spiritual parents dressed us in our bio-body suits and put us in this playpen, which we call a universe, in order to grow in coherence, in order to develop our gifts of intentionality, and in order to become what we are intended to become as co-creators with our spiritual parents. These bio-body suits come in a variety of colors and 2 general unique forms, which we call genders. And they have 4 layers. There is the outer electric monopole layer, substance layer. The first inner layer is the magnetic monopole substance layer. The second inner layer is the emotion substance layer. And the third inner layer is the mind substance layer. And inside of that is a portion of our spirit self, which in essence drives the vehicle. So it's something like a diving bell apparatus which the spirit runs from within in order to sense, experience, and act in this peculiar earth environment. Now, these inner layers are all in what we call a vacuum. So they're non-observable by conventional cognitive faculties. And there's only a portion of our spirit self in this bio-body suit because there isn't enough structure development in these various layers. Okay? So that's part of the limitation. Now, we all know, you all know, that with our eyes we sense only a very small fragment of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so if we say the whole spectrum goes from here to New York, the part we sense is maybe a little wider than this chair. You also know that we sense only a very small fragment of the possible auditory spectrum, the sound spectrum in the universe. So it's obviously not surprising when I suggest to you that we perceive only one band in the spectrum of reality, in the total spectrum of reality. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. Now, all of us are cognitively aware of this electric monopole substance layer. Some are cognitively aware of some of the inner layers, and there are a few individuals that are cognitively aware of all of them. And of course, if one person can do it, it means that potentially all of us can do it, and it means it's a part of the human genome yet to be expressed by us. Okay? So that's part of our future. And the way in which we normally unfold new potentials within ourselves is we work at them. You know, for the outer layer, we go to the gym, or we go to the track, or we do something in order to build that body, okay, the way we want. Well, the same thing with respect to the inner layers. And there are a variety of techniques that can be used to develop inner self-management at these emotional and mental layers, and this magnetic layer I talk about, the first inner layer. The ones that I'm most familiar with are yoga. Okay, and yoga focuses on the mind or the brain in order to still the mind, in order then to be in touch with the deeper self, the larger self. Second would be Qigong, the basis of all the martial arts. There you focus on the Dantian point, just below the belly button, in order to still the mind and make contact with the deeper self. And the third would be heart math, and there you focus on the heart in order to still the mind, in order to make contact with the deeper self. Okay? And with sufficient diligent practice, various levels of adeptship develop, and these manifest in what we call superphysical abilities. Some people call them superphysical abilities. I prefer to call them actualizing the human genome. Okay? Now, part of this process of getting on with this is related to our consciousness. And what is consciousness? To me, consciousness is a concomitant of spirit entering dense matter. And when not much spirit is present in the dense matter, then there is not much awareness. There's not much flexibility. There are not many options seen. And so there's a rather thin line of response to whatever the environmental stimuli are that come to us. But by practice, one can build the structure in these inner layers. And practice, by the way, is just the act of living, but intentionally directed living. That is, for all of us, we need to work on things outside of ourselves in order to build those structures inside ourselves. That's the mechanism. So if indeed we've brought about more consciousness, then it means that we are more aware and we are more flexible and we see a whole variety of options that we didn't see before when stimuli come to us. And we begin to suddenly realize win-win situations in situations that before were win-lose situations. And in fact, we begin to just love our neighbor rather than judge our neighbor. These just become natural consequences of that. So it's a bootstrap process, as far as I can see. And, you know, we've done fairly well. We've come a very long way since we first invested ourselves in the bio-bodysuit of the mammalian ape. But we have a hell of a long way to go, or grow, before we reach home. So that's our task, and it is for us to get on with that particular task of building ourselves, because we are the product of the process. We're built by the process. If we adopt a high-level intention and we play it out in our active life, in every act of our life, because every act of our life is an act of creation, then in essence we build quality and we build structure in these various layers that are involved in the process that we're going through. And so we become. Now, in the outer layer, as Gary was saying earlier this morning, in essence, our neural system, as you all know, are based upon sensing differences. So it is not surprising then that we see ourselves as separate. We see differences. I mean, that's the way the wiring is at that layer. But you know, there's a kind of a mirror relationship between that electric monopole layer and the magnetic monopole layer. So just as we sense differences at the outer layer, we sense similarities at the first inner layer. Okay, so at that layer there are no separation between us. We truly are a unity. We are parts of the spectrum of that domain. Okay, so we're really parts of a family, if you like, part of a larger self. And we might even get to that place of consciousness where we realize that, by God, if we help someone else, we're really helping ourselves. Pretty neat. That's really a win-win-win, squared kind of thing. And I think the thing that is important to realize is that the things that go on in these inner layers, we have to use time because that's the difficulty. They are precursors to what appears in the outer layer world. Okay? In this magnetic domain, which in my modeling is in reciprocal space, there's a sort of a direct space, which is the outer layer, the electric layer. There is a reciprocal space, which is this first inner magnetic layer. And therefore, the coordinates are 1 over distance and 1 over time. So you call those wave numbers or their frequencies, if you like. So there's no distance or time involved. They're the precursors to those actions that we sense as distance and time in the outer domain. And so if we wanted to truly change something out there, the only way we can change it is in here. We have to change it at that reciprocal space level. And if enough of us do it in a coherent way, then that change automatically manifests in that outer world layer. Now, what is holding us up from getting on with this? What's the problem? Well, there are many reasons perhaps, but three I think easily identify. The first one is that we have allowed our life to be so noisy that the signals from these subtle levels are just not seen. Okay? The second one is that we're not coherent enough. If we were more coherent at those levels, then we would make robust signals with huge amplitudes that would just come popping up through the physical noise. And we would be aware. And the third one is perhaps the most important, and that is that we have a mindset that we've been taught and that we've come to believe that there's only these four dimensions of space and time. And that has become a cognitive jail for us. And it is a very difficult jail to get out of. Now, before I go on and return to this business of mindset, because that's really a very important one, what I want to do is I want to say something about mindset. I want to talk a bit about experimental data to show that the four space is not all there is. I want to say a bit about the model. Since Gary has not going to let me use U-foils, I'll have to talk it out. And then I want to say something about coherence and the development of coherence in ourself. Before I do that, I want to give sort of four statements about terms. I want to say something about intentionality and a working example that I like. I want to say something about coherence, an example. I want to say something about how, a metaphor, if you like, for how we can change ourselves at these structural levels. And then I want to say something about three phases of consciousness. Intentionality. The story I would give you is of a person who's become a friend by the name of Dr. Charles Krebs. Grew up an American on the East Coast, became a biologist, worked in environmental biology, was a winner, very bright, very athletic, practiced martial arts, was a diver. Everything he did worked. Okay. He went to Australia, was successful there. One day was out diving with two friends who owned a diving school, and they were diving at 160-foot level out in the boonies. And when he came up with them at the end of the dive, he noticed that he had the bends. And so he went back down. They all went back down. They came up more slowly. He still had the bends. Went back down, came up more slowly, still had the bends, but now he noticed that he was losing sensation in his left foot. They got ashore. They called. They realized that they couldn't go to the normal decompression chamber. It wasn't good enough. They had to go out to the oil drilling rig because that was a 10-atmosphere chamber and had special facilities in it. So they got the helicopter to come. It was a long way. It took something like 5 hours before he got into the decompression chamber, and all the time he was feeling the loss of sensation up his legs and then up his spine. And by the time they put him in the decompression chamber, he was within one vertebrae of that which controlled the breathing, the lungs. He was a quadriplegic at that point. So, in the chamber, he thought long and hard about this. He didn't want to live if he was going to be a quadriplegic. There had also been an experiment with the use of enriched oxygen on rats, and so they decided to try that on him as well as the decompression. The doctor was in there with him. They were in there for 10 days. During that 10-day period, he remembered when he was younger and was doing martial arts and breaking the boards and the bricks. He realized he wasn't doing it with his hand, he was moving chi. He knew an awful lot about neurophysiology, and he decided, let me use that knowledge and let me move chi. And so he started with the vertebrae that was still vital, and he moved chi down his spine. And one by one, he reclaimed the feeling in those vertebrae. When he left the decompression chamber after 10 days, he was not a quadriplegic, he was only a paraplegic. And then in the hospital, he worked on this for 6 months. He began to study all about kinesiology and muscles and things and tapping techniques and what have you. And at the end of 6 months, he was able to move around on crutches. And then he worked for 2 more years at that. And at the end of that time, he could get around without crutches. He still hops a bit because he never did quite get things recovered on his left foot. But everything else is doing just fine. And he now has a new line of work where he has the Melbourne, the Melbourne Center for Applied Physiology. And doing really well in teaching people these techniques and in erasing learning difficulties in people, etc., etc. Remarkable individual, but really first-hand example of intention in action. Now, coherence. That word. If I take this light bulb, actually it's about 150 watts perhaps, or 100 watts. I don't think it's up as bright as it could be, but let's say it's 100 watts. Well, it gives some light, but not a lot of light. And you ask, why doesn't it give a lot of light? And the reason it doesn't is because the photons that are coming out of there are largely canceling with each other. You have what's called destructive interference. Okay? And if you could somehow orchestrate the movement of the photons out of that light bulb so that they all came out in phase with each other, sort of riding on each other's back, the same number of photons coming out per unit time, you would have an energy density between 1,000 and 1,000,000 times the surface of the sun from that light bulb. So what you're seeing is the potential of the light bulb. Right? Doesn't fulfill the potential because it's not coherent. Now we go to humans. We got lots of potential, but we're pretty incoherent still. Okay? Let me say a little bit about how much potential. Quantum theory and relativity theory, you apply it to the vacuum, it says that in 1 cubic centimeter of the vacuum, there is the equivalent energy density of 10 to the 84 grams mass per cc. Now that is more mass than we have encountered in all the planets and stars in all the galaxies that we have seen with our telescopes out to what we think is the rim of the expanding universe. And that's in 1 cc. All right? Imagine what we'll be when we really can tap that. It will grow up, exactly. We will have come home. You got it. That's coherence. Now, how does one do this structuring? I'll say a little bit more about it when I talk about mindset, but an example that I used a long time ago, I'll share with you, is back in the 60s, the way people would make a magnet called permalloy. At that point in time, it was a very strong magnetic material. And General Electric invented the technique. You take the alloy, the metal, you heat it up in a mold, you melt it, and then you pour it. You pour it into a mold, and you let it cool. It cools and it freezes, and then as it cools down further, it goes through the magnetic transition temperature, and the magnetic dipoles start aligning and coming out of there, and there's no constraints, and they therefore go in almost which way directions, Well, it's totally cooled down. You take it out of the mold and you check it, and you find indeed you have a magnet, but it's a lousy magnet. It's not very strong for all the effort you put into it. And you think about it for a while and you think, aha, got an idea. Now what you do is you set up your mold and you put a strong DC magnet around that mold. Now you take your alloy and its crucible and you heat it up and melt it and you pour it into the mold, and it cools down and it freezes and it gets to the transition temperature and it starts to form its magnetic character. But now the magnetic dipoles are forming in the constraint of this external field, so they more closely align with that field. And now when it's cooled down, you take first the magnet, DC magnet away, you take the mold away, you have an ingot which is a very strong magnet. Because you've had less destructive interference, you have more fulfilled the process that was possible, the potential that was there. Now apply that to yourself, apply it to ourselves in terms of, let's say we want to manifest a loving nature. We want to work on our heart to just naturally express a loving nature. So we would then hold an intention field on our being, on our heart. And cells die and new ones are born every moment. And in 7 years, people say all the cells of the body are renewed. So basically it's the same principle. You have this field which you apply and you keep applying it. Of course you forget and then you apply it and you remember it. After a while you just do it automatically, and after a period of time, in fact, you have altered the structure at subtle levels. You can't detect it other than the fact that your behavior has changed. Okay? It's become a little different. And that's the way, that process is really how we build structure into ourselves at the various levels. Okay, the last point before getting to mindset then is consciousness. I read this nice book called cortico-cerebral consciousness. Something like cortico-consciousness, cortico-cerebral consciousness, by an Indian gentleman, an MD, whose name I cannot pronounce even if I read it, so I won't struggle with trying to remember it. But he, amongst all of this neurophysiology stuff, which I'm not really that good at, he had these statements to say about the 3 stages of consciousness development. There was the ascending stage, the first stage, where we do the kinds of things I've talked about, and we build ourselves, and we build ourselves, and we start doing pretty well. We start feeling pretty good about it because we can see the effect. And then there's the transition to the second stage. And it doesn't occur abruptly. It's a gradual transition. These things overlap. And the second stage is the surrender stage, where you give up the personal ego. Okay? You don't give up the big ego, but you give up the little ego, the personal one. And then comes the third stage once you've accomplished that. And again, it's not abrupt. It's an overlapping kind of thing. And that's called the descending branch. And the descending branch is where the spiritual network of the universe works through you into the earth. That seems to be the process. And that's the way we qualify for being an effective part of the spiritual network. All right. That's all preamble. Let's talk a bit about mindset. If someone were to put something unfamiliar to us on the chair and ask us what we perceive that to be, generally we get a lot of different answers. And the reason that they're not the same, that they're different, is because what we take as the perception or the reality of something is a convolution between what is there and what is our mindset. And we have, at the moment, no way of deconvolving these two. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with it. We all are. We just don't say much about it. Lawyers, I think, unconsciously or consciously these days, do that in selecting juries. That is, they find juries and they figure out what their mindset is so that when they're presented with a certain kind of data which is harmful to their client, they won't see it that way. They won't see it quite the same way as others. And that's now that, of course, they have consultants that just do that sort of thing. So that's an important part of mindset. But let's go to the second part, which illustrates how powerful mindset is. And many of you will know about these experiments done in the 30s by Slater, so forgive me if I repeat them for the others. Slater built these glasses called upside-down glasses, which are made of a combination of lenses and prisms tied together, and so that when you put them on, you see everything upside down. And he took 10 or a dozen individuals and asked them to do this. And of course, that's a very destabilizing thing to see people sort of hanging upside down on what should be the ceiling. But he asked them to stay with it and keep wearing the glasses. And they did, albeit with some difficulty. And somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks, one after the other, suddenly there was a flip. With the glasses on, they saw everything right side up. And if they took the glasses off at that point, flip, they'd see everything upside down again. And they'd have to wait another 2 or 3 weeks before, flip, things would go back to normal and they'd see everything right side up. Well, I think that's a remarkable observation, one that should be taught to children in grade school, because it says our mindset and belief system is so strong that it creates a force acting on the neural dendrite system, causing them to grow in such a direction as to build an inversion lens in there, or prism. I don't know what the geometry is, but the body does it. And I think we do this all the time. And of course, these days people are dealing with neural learning to try to get around various difficulties, taking advantage of that. But we're amazingly adaptive creatures. Okay, our bio-body suits are. And this is how we build structure into our bio-body suits. All right? And this is why the jail is so difficult for us to get out of, because we're building the bars by our belief structure. Now, the final example on this, which I found interesting, goes back to something that Darwin wrote about in his diary. When he sailed his sailing ship, the Beagle, into the harbor at Patagonia, and the Patagonians were on the shore, and they could certainly see everything that was in the harbor, but they couldn't see his sailing vessel. Pretty strange. The shaman was there, and he could see the vessel. I presume he had more elevated consciousness. And so he spent some days, some time talking to them, explaining this piece was like that in their experience, and that piece was like that in their experience, and this piece was like something else in their experience. And after doing this for a while, suddenly the Beagle just faded into view, and they saw the Beagle. Okay? So it says on this path of cognitive development for us, we need building blocks that have meaning for us. See, it's meaning that we deal with. All right? In order to understand something, we have to translate it into a meaning and a framework. So if we want to do movement in new domains of cognition, we have to lay a foundation. We have to build some structures, some little building blocks or toy blocks or something. The same kind of thing we do with children. We put them on the floor and we give them these blocks and we say, go ahead, assemble something. And in the act of trying to assemble some things, they gain cognitive development within themselves, as most of you know, and they build something. Well, I think that's the way it is for us with respect to these other domains. And one in particular, the next one I think, which will be our cognitive domain to develop, is the reciprocal space domain. Well, enough for that. Let me now move on and say a little bit about experimental data. I won't say about a lot of experimental data. If you want to ask questions later, I'm happy to talk about it, but I'll just use two pieces. And the first one comes from a nice set of slides that relates to a study I did with a gentleman by the name of Stan Ojak, who after this became a practicing psychologist, and up in Jackson Hole, I guess, Wyoming originally. So now, Stan came to me back in the, oh, let's pass that one. Yeah, that's just this magnet thing. I keep forgetting to take that out. Yeah, we're going to need to turn the lights down as low as possible in order to, so that you can see. And those of you on the side, you probably want to stand in the back here. There are only about 10 slides. Stan is the fellow on your left, my right, and he's a Baha'i, very spiritually developed gentleman, and whose intention with the study I'm about to tell you about is just to reveal God's universe. Here he's at the Temple of the Bab in Haifa with an engineer friend of his, and of course this thing in the foreground and the stuff up around that light, that isn't there in physical reality. Stan came to see me with a bunch of his pictures, and he told me the story that when he was younger, people thought of him as a klutz with respect to cameras, because if they handed him their camera and asked him to take a picture for them, then quite often, not only would they get the picture, but they get other stuff on the film, and so they figured that he was just screwing it up somehow. Well, after the passage of time and this occurrence happening an awful lot, Stan realized that when he had a particular feeling in his 5th cervical and his 7th thoracic, which was his dowsing response, and if he took a picture at that time, he would get something special on the film. So let's go to the next one. So Stan wanted to show me some of his, the other direction. He wanted to show me some of his photographs to see if I would do some work with him. And the technique was it just was a Kodak camera. It was Kodak Kodacolor film, standard Kodak processing. The film was set on a tripod. There was a shutter release. And there was no artificial light that he used. And so here, and Stan gets turned on at conferences like this, spiritual rock conferences and spiritual shrines. And here he's at a rock conference, and of course this stuff that's here, there's no artificial lighting, so that's obviously something from the people. But there are these interesting little seahorse-like things on these contrails that were there, and they're interesting. Let's go to the next one. Here is Uri Geller on stage with a couple of ladies and with these nice, interesting plumes. And here are a couple more of those little seahorses that are there. And the next one. Here's Geller again with the 2 ladies. And again, we've got some little seahorses. And the thing I like, if you look at these time-stopped images of this TV monitor, well, of course, that can't happen. You see. The next one. Well, this was a friend of Seals and Croft were friends of Stan, and I think this might be Seals. It was his birthday, and Stan got him to take a picture, or he allowed Stan to take a picture, and there he is, and looks like we have some little friends down there. But there's all this stuff in the foreground. This thing that looks like a book floating around. Let's go to the next one. Here he is again with a lot of interesting stuff in the foreground. And I thought, well, this is pretty interesting stuff. Sure, let's do an experiment. So I designed an experiment for Stan, and the experiment was to use 2 cameras, one unsensitized and one sensitized. Okay, Stan's camera, the way he sensitizes someone else's camera is to carry it next to him, take it to bed with him for about 3 or 4 days, and then it's sensitized. And he can take these kind of pictures with it. And if he hands it to someone else, then maybe for the next hour, they may get 20% of the pictures like this. And after a couple hours, nothing. So his energy field charges it up in some unspecified way. Well, I couldn't get another camera like the one he had. It was a plastic lens type Kodak they no longer made. And so I got a Minolta. Don't ask me why Minolta and why I didn't buy 2 Minoltas. I didn't have enough money in those days, and I was doing all this stuff on the side. So we got a Minolta. A Minolta is basically a faster, photographically faster camera than the Kodak, but I put them on a single light bar, if you like, and then put them on a single tripod and one shutter release. So both cameras are sort of aligned to the object to be photographed. And let's go to the next one. So here is the Minolta of these 3 men. In particular, I pay attention to this fellow in the back. You can see his feet here. And in particular, this branch, which he's blocking. All right? And let's go to the Kodak now. There's the Kodak. And so here's this fellow. You can see his feet all right, but you can see right through his body, most of it anyway, with this branch. Okay? Neat, isn't it? Let's go to the next one. Here's Geller on stage with a couple of ladies, and there's a blackboard on the other side of Geller, which he's blocking with his body. The next slide. Here's the Kodak. There's some kind of stuff coming from this lady to Geller, but you can see mostly right through him to the blackboard. Yeah. Next one. This was a Kubler-Ross conference in Monterey, and I'd like you, this is the Minolta, of course. Pay attention to the light wells, and the next one's the Kodak. Oh. This is really interesting stuff. Sort of makes you think there might be something else out in there in the universe than just what we think of as pore space. Well, we decided we couldn't quite figure out how to top this, and then we did think of something. And we decided to do a study with, take some pictures at Stanford Chapel, and the first picture would be with the lens cap off the camera, and then the next 3 would be with the lens cap on the camera. Okay. So let's go to the next one. This is Stanford Chapel, pretty dark in there this day, but you can see the stained glass windows, so sunlight. So this is with the lens cap off. This next one, this one has the lens cap, the first one with the lens cap on the camera. Okay? This is, the lens cap is covering the lens. This one. This one. Let's go back, the one before, just, so this is with the lens cap has been taken off the camera. And that's right. And this is with the lens cap on the camera. And the next one is the second one with the lens cap on the camera. And the next one was totally black, so you don't see anything. Okay? Okay. All right. Let's go back 3 of them. This is a black, the standard Kodak lens cap. Yep, exactly. So this is the one. The lens cap has been taken off the camera in this case. It's off the Kodak. This is the Kodak camera, and the lens cap. Stan is taking the picture. He's got the camera is on a stand on a tripod, and he's using the shutter release. And this is what he has with the lens cap off the camera. And this is the first one with the lens cap having been put on the camera. First. Well, might be. Yeah, it's possible that should be turned around.
That explains everything.
Yeah, right. And here's the second one. Anyway, so one sees the effect die down, and by the time we took the third one, and there wasn't a long time between the 3, it had gone to 0. So whatever was in there needed to cause this to happen had been used up.
Dr. Keller, what
yes.
was your personal reaction when you first realized something like that?
Outstanding! Awesome.
Were you expecting it to be that way, or you just...
No. I mean, basically, the intention was to just do the experiment and see what came. I mean, and his intention was just to reveal God's universe. And I had enough faith in Stan that when he felt it was time to take a photograph, that something would come up and I'd learn something. And this is what I learned. Now, Stan has just recently retired from his tour of duty as a practicing psychologist. And after a couple of years of getting over that, he is now ready for work again. So I bought him 2 cameras this time, identical cameras. And he's getting himself back in shape, and we're going to do a study with lens cap on the camera, but one camera, all of them. And in this case, though, what kind of materials can I put in the one with the lens cap that will will block more or not block?
How about throw in a video camera too?
Well, first step first. Maybe, doing I do them step by step. There's a question down here too.
So in your paradigm, you're calling this next reality a reciprocal domain?
Well, I'll come to that in just a couple of minutes, but basically the subtle domains, the reciprocal, which I think of as part of the physical. We only know half of the physical, and this is another part of the physical. And then the emotional domain and the mind domain, that all of these are part of what will come to us as we unfold further. And so, but the next one is the one right adjacent to the physical, the counterpart to what we are presently cognitively aware of. And both of those domains, I believe, are functioning in us all the time. We're just only consciously aware of part of it.
So would you hypothesize that you're getting some feedback from this other domain with these pictures?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
My intention with these pictures is just, without going into a lot of detail, is that to say, do you know anyone based upon conventional science that can explain those?
Right.
And my answer is no. And therefore, they are indeed in these other domains or something which approximates other domains.
Just a brief sharing that parallels this. Judith and I were doing some training of some postdoctoral therapists and with closed circuit television, and I was doing some energy work. And I left the room. The person was on a flat surface on the floor, and I asked them to sit up. And when I got in the next room, the video camera was recording something like this that the person was now sitting up in the middle of, and then we happened to have an orthopedic surgeon who was walking down the hall who was nuts and bolts, and so we started doing experiments with this. Took the person out, and the form that had been released in that work stayed in the room for about 3 days.
Oh, yeah.
And we have video of that.
That's terrific. I mean, it's...
Be glad to show it to you.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much. I mean, we've hardly scratched the surface. I think we're hardly babes crawling on the floor of the universe, I think. And there's so much there which we will unfold in time. Since we'll go here and then we'll come back to you.
What you've just shown us here reminded me of a book that I saw about 30 years ago, in which, I don't remember who it was able to imagine something and have a photograph taken of his face, which would then show what he was imagining.
Well, there was the Eisenbud work with Ted Sirios. I don't know whether that was it or maybe it's another one.
No.
But none of those that I had seen before are as clear and sharp as Stan's. We did experiments with Stan just holding in a cassette, basically a photographic film adjacent to his forehead or in his hand, and trying to imprint on it directly that way. And we got something, different colors and such, but nothing like these sharp images. I think this lady had a question earlier. Do you still have it?
Yeah, I'm just curious, what was the time frame between when the lens cap was off and then it was on? And how fast did all that happen?
I wish I could remember. The time frame between, I would say that everything occurred within less than 5 minutes. All four shots.
Seems like the second shot, when it was first on, was clearer than when it was off.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was.
Much clearer.
Yeah, that's right. And so the point is, you're not using, I deduce from this, you're not using normal light. You're using some other kind of light in the universe that's giving you the representation, and that Stan's energy field is such that that not only is that can that light come through something we think of as opaque, but Stan's energy field sensitizes that level of the film so that the imprint from that level is carried through to the silver halide grains at the physical level so that it goes through the normal processing.
Did Stan happen to say, was it similar to what he was seeing?
No, I didn't say. And Stan wasn't really seeing anything per se. I mean, other than he's seeing the room. Yeah, I mean, his eyes were open. Yeah. So, anyone else before we go on? Yeah. Either one.
I just wanted to clarify her question. Stan was not intentionally putting his energy in a particular direction other than to reveal God's universe.
That's right.
And so every time these pictures were taken, that was his only
That was
intention.
his only real intention.
Not anything to do with light or
No.
what was going to come.
No.
Okay.
No details, just
that always.
always.
And was he operating the shutter on the Minolta also?
He basically, the shutter on the Minolta and the Kodak, when they were done
They were
together,
simultaneous?
they were simultaneous.
So what would account for the Minolta and the Kodak being different if his intention was the same?
Because only one of them was sensitized.
Oh, he had sensitized. Oh, okay.
He sensitized the Kodak and,
Right.
and not the
Not the
Minolta.
Minolta,
No,
okay.
we were very careful not to do that. We never let Stan load the cameras or unload the cameras or anything like that. No. Yeah. Right.
It appeared to me that there was light bouncing off the backs of the seats, almost like a flash, which made me wonder, is there some source of light coming from Stan?
Well, there is a source of light coming from Stan. Stan's energy field is such, well, I'll tell you how I would rationalize that, if you like, but I have to use some technical terms. He is emitting subtle energy field because he is who he is. His being is doing that. So he's a light source at these subtle levels. My modeling says that the substance at the subtle levels can interact with the substance at the physical level and create a correlate on the interface between the two. And the correlate is magnetic vector potential, which it turns out is the one of the two primary potentials that give rise to the electric field and the magnetic field. Okay? I won't go through the mathematics of it, but that's the relationship. But it is interesting that the time derivative of the magnetic vector potential is an electric field. And if, in fact, in the total darkness, you take a film in a cassette and you put it in an electric field, it will develop. Okay? It's not, I mean, there's a connection. The details of the connection, I don't really know at this point. Yes.
Does Stan have any other unusual or psychic
yeah.
capacities?
Yes,
Could
I
you
mean-
tell us briefly about those?
Well, certainly at those days, I mean, he could do it with sound devices too, all kinds of sound things. Or he would walk down the street and he would see people fade in and out of his visual field, and he would see people that weren't there in physical reality and so on. I mean, he had a lot of these things going for him. And it's interesting also as a practicing psychologist that he carried about 2 times the patient load of his colleagues in that operation and had about 4 times the success rate, which isn't surprising. He was putting this energy into the healing modality.
It's interesting. He had all these things going for him.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are in institutions that have those things going for them. I just thought I'd point that out.
Okay.
You seem to indicate that he lost something in the process of practicing as a psychologist,
He
and
lost-
now he's sort of regenerating.
He lost his sense of joy in living. Yeah, well, I mean, he was deep in. I mean, he was working with a bunch of colleagues that are somewhat like my Stanford colleagues. They don't make life too wonderful. But nonetheless, joking aside, I think the last several years he was having a hard time with respect to that. And so he really needed to get back this sense of joy. And so when I spoke to him, it was always about that kind of thing, of just letting go of this stuff and wash yourself clean and just be joyful. And here's a couple of cameras, and when you practice and so on, and when you're starting to get it back, let's do something.
How many years did he practice approximately?
Well, he practiced from 15 years, I think, from 1980 to 1995. 1996 is 16 years, yeah. I think this lady over here was next.
What do you make of the little white?
I don't know. I think they're interesting. I mean, that's why I call them seahorses. But there's a lot of that stuff around. And at this point, I just don't know. I always intended to do lots more experiments, but didn't happen back in those days. Stan used this for a thesis at the International College in Los Angeles. That's what he...
Bill?
Yes.
Why don't you take one more question, and we need a break, and then we can resume?
Okay.
Okay.
One more question over here. The gentleman in...
I'm a very beginning practitioner of Kundalini Mahayoga, and it sounds like what you're talking about is very similar to, to the science of yoga.
Absolutely. That's what I say. It's one of the techniques of inner self-management at emotional and mental levels. I mean, it's the oldest and the best known one. Yeah.
Would you consider consulting with some spiritual teachers about what the nature of the phenomena that you're seeing is?
Well, it's really interesting, and let me just share this because I think it's important that you get this. About 1976, 75, 76, I had developed 90 to 95% of my present model picture, and I wanted to talk to someone about it. I wanted to get some feedback. My colleagues who had the training that might be able to give me some feedback weren't interested. Most of the people that were interested didn't have the training to give me feedback. But up at Berkeley at that time was the one who talked about the blue pearl, Muktananda. I went to see Muktananda. I thought, he will know. And he felt like it's just an old chum to me. And so we got together, and he had his interpreters there, and we sat down, everybody clustered around like this, and we had this conversation that went on for an hour or more, and I would say something and ask him a question, and then he would say something and it would get translated, and it would be very pretty poetry and such, and I would say, go deeper. And then he would say something more, and I keep saying, go deeper, and so on. And we kept doing this. And after half to three-quarters of an hour, I realized he knew what I was talking about, but he had never used the set of symbols that I was using and that I wanted him to answer in. See, it's that problem. The problem often, it's not in knowing. It's in articulating the knowing in the frame of consciousness that we find ourselves. So it's really a very key point. So going to, in my experience, has been going to spiritual masters. They have developed capacities within themselves, and in their language can interpret those things. But I've yet to find one that can do it in my language. Okay, and my role is I'm trying to build a bridge between conventional science and a science of these domains, and therefore it has to be in that language. So it's interesting. Yeah.
We want to continue this. It's time for a break. But one thing thank you, Bill. But one thing I would like to just emphasize is, while for many of you this bit about surrogate muscle testing or intuitive testing may seem like way out and woo-woo and on the edge, etc., my guess to you is that 10 years from now we're going to look back and find kind of like this is the very beginning stage, and it will be very routine. And we're in kindergarten.
If I can just add on a little bit, because basically in chapter 3 or 4 of my book, where I described the experience I had in the 70s when I was working with a dowser, And we use a dowsing wand to measure energy fields and to discharge energy fields and upset our own internal circuits and then restore them again, learning these various techniques and such. And I used it then for quite a while for healing, working on myself and on anyone else, and I would discharge from, like I mentioned, the apple and such, through myself into basically a jar of poisons, okay? Because that's a good sink for such energies. But after a while, I decided, I don't want to be dependent upon this as a crutch. I want to build myself. And so I gave up the crutch and I just used my hands. Now, it wasn't nearly as efficient initially, but 20 years later.
Tomorrow, by the way, we give up the crutch. You can give it up.
Yeah. Back in the 70s, as an outgrowth of the work I had been doing on Kirlian photography, and the work that we had done was to show where the energies came from, where the colors came from, what was the physical process involved in it, and etc. My student at the time thought that other people's work, which showed some really strong energy effects of a non-physical nature, seemingly non-physical nature, that was just sloppy experimental technique. I didn't agree with him. My intuition was that there was something real there that I couldn't write off. And so I pursued trying to think of a way to reveal some human interactive effect with this process. And what I ended up with was building a device, and the device was shaped like a sandwich. The bread of the sandwich were dielectric sheets, like quartz or glass. The meat of the sandwich was a particular gas. Okay? And the whole thing was wrapped in a phenolic frame so it would be sealed tight. And then there were two thin gold electrodes put on the outside of each, the top and the bottom. And we would electrically ground the bottom and apply a high voltage to the top. And we would, often we would put this device in a little Faraday cage. We would, the protocol for this experiment was the following. We would set, I'll have to say a little bit about the physics first. When you set the voltage below breakdown, what happens is there are little burps of electrons that go across that gas, and you can take those and you can put them on an oscilloscope so you can see them. They go very quickly. I mean, something like 1/100th of a microsecond across this gap, which is the order of 2 millimeters thick. You can take that current and you can put it in a counting circuit, so you could count these little burps, these micro avalanches they're called, or you could set the sensitivity on the counting circuit so that it just would not count the biggest ones that were present in the system. And what that would mean is you would have a poised system. Okay, you've got a voltage on it below breakdown, but just sort of sitting there and no counts on the counter. And the protocol then was to go up, stand in front of it, intending nothing, and just stand there for 5 minutes, and you would get 0 counts. And then you put your hands around the device or around the Faraday cage around the device. You don't want to get your hands too close to it or you get shocked. As if you were trying to heal it. Nothing would happen for the order of a minute, minute and a half, and then suddenly, whoop, 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 you'd start hearing counts occurring. And if your eyes were open, you'd see flashes of light coming through these gold electrodes because they were very thin. And at the end of 5 minutes, you'd stand back and intend nothing, and the system would still burp and burp and burp and eventually would die down. And you look at the counter, and you had 0 counts from the first 5 minutes, and now for this 5 minutes plus the run-on, you might have 50,000 counts. So that's a very robust experiment, okay, going from 0 to 50,000. And so we did a whole variety of experiments with this. We did them with all kinds of people, men, women, children, gurus, nurses, etc., we found the best candidates were computer science students. We'll see why perhaps later. When the device was working, anyone could make it work. But there were some times when the device didn't work, and we didn't know why. Was it the device? Was it the environmental energy field? Was it our own individual energy fields? We don't know. Wouldn't work maybe for a week to 2 weeks, and then suddenly it would start working again. And go for maybe another month, and then same thing happened. So that was interesting. But over the course of the experimentation, we began to discover a variety of things. One which was important, at least one which was important, and that was if we were on the other side of the room, I and my students who were doing this on the side also, talking about other experiments that we were doing, and then if we switched our attention to that device, which was just sitting there in this poised way, not counting, suddenly it would start chattering. Yeah, that was interesting. And likewise, we could have it running all day, no counts, and overnight, no counts, and we could be walking down the hall and get ready to open the lab in the morning, and as we're walking down the hall and get close to the lab, we suddenly start chattering. And the record trace shows that. So we thought, well, gee, maybe the mind's involved in this experiment. And so we did an obvious experiment, that is to stand there and not put our hands around the device in the second part of the protocol, but to intend to mentally interact with the device. And we got counts. We found that we got many more counts in the with mind portion of the experiment than without hands experiment. Okay, with the no intention. Well, that was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't really a robust experiment. The robust experiment, the first one, was to do the following with the protocol. You stand up there for 5 minutes intending nothing, 0 counts. Stand up there, put your hands around it for 5 minutes, intending, and you maybe 50,000, 60,000 counts, step back, let it die down to 0, then stand in front of it intending nothing for 5 minutes, 0 counts. Then the next 5 minutes, put your hands around it, but now put your mind on an arithmetical problem. 2 plus 2 is 4, 3 plus 3 is 6, 4 plus 4 is 8, 48 plus 48 is 96, etc., etc., etc. 0 counts. Really interesting. So it suggests, indeed, that we did another robust experiment, which was to put ourselves in a Faraday cage with this device, with this little Faraday cage around it 15 feet away. And when I was the subject, what I did was I just laid there and I visualized the device at my solar plexus and 25,000 counts. So we only did a small number of those experiments. We did hundreds to thousands of the others. So anyway, the conclusion of that is that the human emits an energy that can influence electron avalanches in a gas discharge. And furthermore, the human can direct it with his mind, either into the device or away from the device. So that was interesting. And again, going back to the explanation I gave relative to Stan and the magnetic vector potential, if the human being is emitting subtle energy fields or a magnetic vector potential field, then the subtle energy fields will create a magnetic vector potential field, and if its time-varying character has a time-varying character, that field inside the little sandwich would be the same thing as increasing the voltage. It would increase the size of the avalanche, would increase the count. So that's a rational kind of explanation. Good. Okay, that's all I intended to say about experiments. There's quite a bit more in the book, but experiments that cannot be explained within the conventional force-based paradigm and the limits that we presently put on that. Giving some support for the idea that there are other forces in nature and other domains in which they function. I had intended then to tell you something about the model and then to tell you something about coherence development itself, talking about the HeartMath stuff. But what Gary and I have decided to do is just open it for questions of any kind that you would like to ask, and we will just deal with the rest of the time with me that way. So why don't we start?
I want to know how you do that detoxification yourself without any equipment, and how do I learn to do that?
All right. It grew out of the work that I did with the dowser, and we developed energy circuits, which I talk about, I think, in chapter 3 or 4 of the and basically. Because of that, I knew that if I put hands on the body, or I felt, okay, that if I put hands on the body in a certain way, I would move energy beneficially in the body and heal stress. Or if I put them in a reverse way, I would create an upset and tensions, etc. And I did a variety of experiments with those sorts of things. I found that in fact, if I just sat with my palms closed, watching television or something, or sleeping or whatever, just casually while I'm doing something else, and not just the tips of the fingers, but the actual palm to palm, then I would feel energy flow in the circuit of the body, the upper circuit of the body, up the arms and across the trunk and down, and it would go around, and the more that happened, it seemed as if the resistance was lower and more energy was flowing because my hands always felt warmer and I was able to do more. And then my son would have some headaches or something, and I would take, let's try your sunglasses, or I would do two things. I'd sort of put left hand in the front of his head and the right hand at the base of his brain, and that would help him. But if he put the sunglasses back on, his headaches would come back. I'd say, well, give me the sunglasses, and take the sunglasses. And I would initially use this dowsing wand thing I mentioned before and just discharge it into a jar of poisons. Okay? But then eventually I just didn't want to go that way because I wanted to build myself, and so I would then take the glasses and hold them in my hand, and I would just discharge it. Every once in a while I would crack my wrist, because what happens is the energy flows through, it seems to build up at the joints. So I would just crack the joints, and that would allow the flow to continue. And so I would just move it over the parts of the object, and eventually I would feel it would be discharged, and give it back to him, and headache's gone. And so the same thing with the apple or fruit or whatever. So it's really a kind of adjunct to the healing process, and there's some knowledge that's useful, which is in the book, but there is the intention to try and to do it, okay, and then just practice. And this thing I found was useful to come upon that. And you can do the same thing with your feet to build the foot circuit. And dealing with the palm chakras, this one, and the other with the feet chakra.
How long did you hold those?
Well, I mean, I did it. The point is, this thing is it's not a short-term thing. It becomes a life process. And I'll give you an example of what I meant. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the 50s and the 60s, whenever it got cold and damp, or I would overwork, and I have a tendency to overwork, I would get back pains, lower back pains. And I would have to go to a chiropractor every year. And I would go for about 3 months. The first month, 3 times a week. The second month, twice a week. Third month, once a week. And I thought, oh, hell, I'm just tired of this stuff. Here I'm doing all this energy stuff. Why don't I try it on myself? So I get disciplined at times, and so I get up in the morning. The first thing I do is I sit on the toilet, and I start with my hands as high up on my back as I can reach, hold them there for maybe a minute, in the beginning maybe 2 minutes, and then down to palm width, and then down to palm width, and down to palm width, all the way down to the coccyx. And I did that every morning and every night, the last thing before going to bed at night. I didn't have to go to the chiropractor for 20 years. Okay? And I built, again, it's pumping and practice and doing. You could feel the innervation going on, so it's part of the process. Another one, which is again simple, and you guys do it with all your tapping. I was having trouble with my eyes and driving with glasses and stuff, and it was problematical. And I someone told me, well, gee, the Chinese, when they have those problems, they start working on acupuncture points, and so there were acupuncture points. So I would start massaging this point about 15 times each way, and then this set of points, and then this set of points, and then this set of points, and this set of points, and then around the eye. And I would do that at the same time when I was doing this, and two things in parallel, and I see better now than I did 20 years ago. And so, again, there are just these kinds of things that you can do for yourself. And the more you do, the more you can do. And most recent experience was the one with being involved with the HeartMath people and the work there of focusing on the heart and really the thymus, for me to feel the thymus and to love different portions of the body. And I find it isn't necessary to use the hands. You just basically can direct it to those places on the body. If I'm out walking and I start getting a Charlie horse, I keep walking and say, love for that right calf, love for that right calf, love for that right calf, and be in my heart, and so on. And if I'm somewhere else, then I do the same thing. I don't know what words to use, etc., but just do that, and that helps focus the energy there, and it works.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. How long do you hold this palm thing to get your hands' energy going?
Oh no, I don't hold it. I mean, that is what I did 20 years ago when I wanted to increase the capacity to pump energy. Once you, I mean, it's a process that once you build the capacity to pump energy, I mean, you got it. You're opening your chakras, your palm chakras. No, not anymore. I sometimes do it just because I like it. Sometimes I even sleep that way just because I like it. The energy flow, if I constricted it all in my chest, then I will do that, and then it will just open up and loosen. But it's, I look at it just like muscle building, and it's just practice, just diligent practice. No big deal.
I just realize now why before I go to sleep I crack my knuckles.
Okay.
And it's the only time I do it. It's Now I have an explanation to give to my wife.
You think she'll believe you?
I'd like to ask you a question relating this to therapy. What Gary said before and what you mentioned about there's a person, the therapist or practitioner, client, and universe.
Yeah. And sometimes there's an instrument.
Okay.
A device.
At different times, at different places. Now, if you had one client and 5 therapists simultaneously doing intention, taking in of information, surrogate muscle testing, and you have 5 different responses or 5 different points or whatever it is you're focusing on, in practical terms, what are you saying about what that person needs? Are you looking at just different aspects, all roads may lead to Rome? And also, is it then become the truth, what you're resonating with, the part of the gestalt that you're picking up? How do you explain that?
It's a very complicated question that you've asked. And so let me try it this way. If you take 5 individuals and you train them by the same, really rigorously train them by the same techniques, and you ask them to be disciplined and only use those techniques, then you will get the same kind of answers. Okay? Similarly, all right? The dilemma is it's hard to control the outside life aspect. If you all build yourselves to the level where you don't need any of these training wheels, okay, then you are just radiating energy to these people, going in the various acupuncture points that some need it, some don't, but the essential ones will get washed with them, and it will bring about the needed change for them. In terms of truth, you know, truth is a moving target, in essence, and it's based upon our modeling, you know, truth within a kind of model structure, and you have to design your experiments to reveal that kind of truth. It doesn't mean there isn't other truth or deeper truth, or that it will change. I mean, for the longest time, I thought of myself I was bipolar and I had to do things this way and that way. And then one day, 10 years, 15 years later, I realized, didn't really, I just could do just one hand would do it, didn't need two hands, didn't need it in that particular arrangement. But I realized that my structure had changed. I mean, I had altered the structure. The largest experience, you know, the example is the following. There are many inventors out there that work on these free energy machines. And I looked at those things years ago, came to the conclusion that the inventors are part of the energy circuit. And they don't realize that they're an essential part of the energy circuit. Okay? And so when they're not in the circuit, the thing doesn't function. And that's the way you guys as therapists are. You're part of the device. You're part of that circuit, that larger circuit. And where you are and what your attitude is, what you're holding, etc., all of those things relate to the healing process and how much and how pure is your intention, etc., all of those things.